During the Second World War, and in the wake of Operation Barbarossa launched by the Third Reich into the heart of the Soviet motherland, the Battle of Stalingrad transpired. Stalingrad, bearing the name of Joseph Stalin, infamous within Germany's history books for its greatest defeat at the hands of the Soviet Union, and famous among Russians, considered to be one of the greatest battles that took place in their Great Patriotic War. Many historians, however, believe it to be a psychological turning point of World War II, specifically within the European theater. It became evident both to the Red Army and the Wehrmacht that only movement toward the west to Germany from here on out, where Berlin would inevitably share the same fate as Stalingrad. Halting the Wehrmacht's endless set of victories, the Red Army refuted the Nazi war machine's notion of invincibility, marking the milestone for which the entire war would turn in favor of the Allies. Capturing the city would inevitably cut off the Soviet supply lines into southern Russia, ultimately giving the Wehrmacht's logistical advantage over the Red Army. The German leadership saw Stalingrad as an anchor for its northern flank in service to the colossal push into the Caucasus, where oil fields and resources resided that the Nazi war machine so desperately needed to fuel its tanks and planes. Reviewed by Hitler himself, Case Blue or Fall Blau, described in the Führer Directive number 41 on April 5, 1942, was intended to achieve that goal. Led by the Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, Army Group South would lead the offensive following Hitler's strategy to annihilate the Red Army in the south, then seizing the resources in the Caucasus, and from there they would either link back up with Army Group Center for the Battle of Moscow or drive further into the Caucasus. Case Blue commenced on June 28th of 1942, and during the first 5 months of the invasion, German forces dealt the Red Army a series of devastating defeats. On paper, the Soviet military was formidable, but most of its equipment was old. Its training was frequently inadequate, and its stockpile of precision targeting instruments, radios, and optics, and even maps of its own land was woefully inadequate. However, it was evident that despite the early victories of the Germans, they did not achieve Case Blue's goals. In spite of the superior military hardware and soldiers to that of the Soviet counterpart, the Germans still lost Stalingrad, not to mention the Luftwaffe's dominating the sky. Thus, it all comes down to the competency of leadership that decided the outcome of the battle. Due to Stalin's purge of the Soviet military, the Red Army's leadership severely lacked competency to face its battle-hardened and experienced leadership of the Wehrmacht's command and Luftwaffe, which should have given an edge to the Nazis. However, this was not the case as Hitler took on more responsibility for himself as time went on, executing orders upon information that was out of date, and this proved to be futile, more so with bad news as it took time to get information directly from the front lines to his headquarters in Berlin. Flexibility of one's military is vital to success in battle, and despite superior German leadership in regards to its decorated generals, they were undermined by Hitler's dictatorial authority. Quoted from General Alfred Jodl, one of Hitler's closest men throughout the war, he says that if there is anything that clearly demonstrates the revolutionary character of Hitler's method of military leadership, it is that he did not concede to his military working staff, the OKW, and within it, the operations staff, the role of strategic advisor. This clearly portrayed the German leadership's struggles boiling down to one man. However, many other factors contributed to the outcome of the battle. In this video, I will examine and discuss how significant the Germans' leadership was to its defeat of Stalingrad, in terms of Hitler's personal involvement and the German High Command's response to being encircled, and a failure of the Luftwaffe, as well as contrasting it to that of the Soviets. Operation Fallblau commenced in the summer of 1942, launching a major offensive into southern Russia with a force of 1,300,000 men, 1 million of which were Wehrmacht soldiers. Through Hitler's coercion, the Wehrmacht received an additional 52 non-German divisions from its Axis powers such as Spain and Italy, along with its satellite states with the likes of Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary, making up to around 300,000 more men. Their presence in Russia compensated for the shortage of manpower. In spite of this, however, it rendered German generals nervous, as they realized they were now dangerously reliant on men with dubious training and expertise, whose tenacity and allegiance under fire has not been proven in combat. The Axis forces never resurrected to its former glory after the losses it sustained in the Russian Winter War from 1941 to 1942 during Operation Barbarossa. The entire Eastern Front faltered on the brink of collapse for a period after divisions and divisions of well-equipped Russians suited to the Winter War appeared out of nowhere and assaulted. In response to the disaster, Hitler took personal charge of the army, dismissing some of the world's best military minds, including generals who developed blitzkrieg and engineered the lightning-quick triumphs over Poland and France. Hitler, in their place, went through the maps and made crucial strategic decisions on his own. In addition to the aforementioned input on Hitler by General Jodl and the logistical problem for which Hitler's command fell under, Hitler moreover had a poor work ethic. On a daily basis he would remain until 4 a.m. or thereabouts, proceeding to sleep until noon, holding his first military conference of the day to consult the events that happened while he was sleeping. He was also sidetracked by unrelated political and Nazi party issues at the time. An example of this can be drawn with him being away from his headquarters during the American reinforcements that were landing in North Africa, attending the annual commemoration of the Beer Hall Putsch, which occurred in 1923. Hitler's poor leadership resonated even to that of the most loyal to him, such as Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, where he would go on to say the following: "He was a man who saw fighting only in terms of the utmost brutality. His way of thinking conformed more to a mental picture of masses of the enemy bleeding to death before lines than to the conception of a subtle fencer who knows how to make an occasional step backwards in order to lunge for the decisive thrust. For the art of war, he substituted a brutal force which, as he saw it, was guaranteed maximum effectiveness by the willpower behind it. Despite the pains Hitler took to stress his own former status as a frontline soldier, I still never had the feeling that his heart belonged to the fighting troops. Losses, as far as he was concerned, were merely figures which reduced fighting power. They are unlikely to have seriously disturbed him as a human being." By midsummer, as when the two army groups and their 700 tanks inched closer to the oil fields and Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht's severely constrained manpower in the southern region forced a key decision: which one of the two primary objectives should be accomplished first? Originally, Hitler's plan was to head straight for the Caucasus oil fields and order the 4th Panzer Army to link up with the 1st Panzer Army, who was already approaching the oil fields in the south. However, after learning that the Soviets had almost left Stalingrad undefended, he ordered the 4th Panzer Army to turn around and drive back towards Stalingrad. However, the 4th Panzer Army did not approach Stalingrad with the lightning force and speed like they did in the Battle of France, allowing time for the Soviet forces to bolster their defense within the city, building extensive trenches and obstructions. In light of this, Hitler ordered the attack to proceed furthermore, changing his plans as the 1st Panzer Army was simultaneously also to capture the Caucasus oil fields. Hitler's constant altercation of original plans did not resonate well with Germany's generals, as they would prefer to take one objective with overwhelming force. Many believe that his decision would result in a similar situation to that of the disaster at the previous Battle of Moscow. Top Wehrmacht generals advised Hitler to conquer Stalingrad first, utilizing all available assets before continuing on to the oil fields in the Caucasus. Hitler had rejected their advice about the dangers of Moscow the year before. He ignored their warning concerning Stalingrad now, insisting, as he did a year before, that the Red Army would be annihilated if they executed his strategy. Chief of the Army General Staff, General Halder, and Field Marshal List, commander of the Army Group A in the Caucasus, were two of his most senior officers who publicly condemned the plan. Hitler retaliated by dismissing both commanders and assumed command role as commander-in-chief of all Caucasus forces. In the beginning of the offensive, Hitler had about 1,900 tanks and 1,610 aircraft at his disposal. Whilst the Red Army's quota of tanks outnumbered the Wehrmacht and the planes matching the numbers of the Luftwaffe, the German military's hardware were unrivaled, as the Soviet technology was out of date, proving to be significantly inferior to that of the German counterpart. Initially, the offensive went well under the command of General Paulus of the prized veteran 6th Army, and by October much of the city was in German hands, pushing Soviet forces to the river banks of the Volga. Stalingrad, in the eyes of the Soviet leadership, could not allow for its capitulation, as it embodied the very image of the Soviet leader himself, Stalin. Thus, Stalin issued Order 227, also known as "Not One Step Back." The order forbade any retreat under any circumstances, with Stalin himself remarking, "You can no longer retreat. There is only one road ahead, the road that leads forward. Stalingrad will be saved by you or wiped out with you." However, despite this Luftwaffe's success in repelling Soviet attacks dominating the skies, Soviet forces soon adapted to the disadvantage under Stalin's order hugging the German advance, resulting in brutal close-quarter combat, rendering German artillery and aircraft to be unusable in fear of friendly fire. Concurrently, Soviet General Georgy Zhukov bolstered his forces on both ends of the city and began a huge counteroffensive in November to encircle and trap von Paulus's Sixth Army. Hitler had gravely depleted his flanks by sending units into Stalingrad that were supposed to serve as a rear guard, leaving the responsibility of the flanks to fall under foreign forces from its Axis partners. Marshal Zhukov of the Soviet Union had taken advantage of Hitler's mistakes and devised and launched a counteroffensive in an attempt to circle the Germans within. The German generals' greatest concerns were fulfilled as their unreliable Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies quickly folded in against the Red Army's offensive. Soviet forces from the north and south smashed a way through the collapsing lines and joined up, encircling and trapping the whole Sixth Army within Stalingrad in under 3 days. General Zetzler, chief of the Army General Staff, begged Hitler to permit Paulus's Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement while it was still feasible, as only a few depleted Red Army units were cutting them off. Hitler's response was simply, "I won't go back from the Volga." Instead, Hitler's plans were to utilize the Luftwaffe to resupply the trapped Sixth Army within Stalingrad via air, which will be examined later in this video. All the while, Field Marshal Manstein would fight their way into Stalingrad, relieving Paulus, which would be called Operation Winter Storm. Led by General Raus, his panzer units came close as 35 miles from Stalingrad, but never managed to penetrate the Red Army's entrenched positions. On December 23rd, Manstein cancelled his plan to relieve the Sixth Army in fear of being encircled himself. It was evident that Manstein's plan had failed, or had he? Although Field Marshal Manstein had not made any particular major errors regarding Operation Winter Storm, his talent and genius would not suffice alone. Manstein lacked the supplies, manpower, and vehicles to execute his plan to the full extent possible for victory. Tasked with opening a route for assets to flow into Stalingrad, he did not succeed in this context. Moreover, the Sixth Army within made little effort with its depleted forces to attempt a link-up with Manstein's forces. Instead, they were merely sat and waited. Manstein justified his failure of Operation Snowstorm in a post-war memoir, The Failure at Stalingrad, by comparing it to the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans under the command of King Leonidas took on hundreds of thousands of the invading Persians in an effort to buy the Greek city-states time to organize a defense. Manstein rationalized the loss of the Sixth Army as a necessity to buy time for the reorganization of the southern front, where its shattered forces could be rebuilt from the ground up. However, the German Sixth Army was simply not disposable force that should be sacrificed for a greater good. With reference to a German staff officer, he wrote, "An army of 300,000 men is not a machine gun nest or a bunker whose defenders may under certain circumstances be sacrificed for the whole." To simply put it, the failure of Manstein's attempt at rescuing the Sixth Army was a failure, and the loss of the Sixth Army as a whole was even more so of a catastrophe, and comes due with all respect to the poor decision-making in which its evacuation was denied by the Führer, whilst it had a chance of breakout. Field Marshal Manstein's odds of defending off the Red Army's advance were slim. As situations occurred, Manstein would divert and shuffle forces under his command, utilizing limited reinforcement that managed to arrive, essentially managing pandemonium that was created by Hitler himself and the rest of the general staff. In his leisure time, he sought to reason with Hitler and the rest of the general staff, proposing the withdrawal of the Wehrmacht from the Caucasus and the unification of depleted remnants of the German forces. As with the majority of officers who had tried to persuade Hitler to agree upon a temporary withdrawal, Manstein was met only with frustration from Führer's stubbornness. It was only a month after General Zetzler's constant pleading did Hitler order a retreat from the Caucasus, but nonetheless not Stalingrad. Hitler's idea of aerial resupply, however, was doomed from the outset. Amidst Göring's assurances that his Luftwaffe could execute the task, harsh weather prevented the supply planes from flying missions. On the occasion that the Luftwaffe could fly, Soviet anti-aircraft guns and fighters cleared them from the skies. As a result of this, only 350 tons of equipment and supplies from the original requirement of 500 tons were delivered to the Sixth Army. So this raises the question as to why the Luftwaffe failed so miserably at resupplying the Sixth Army within Stalingrad. Because the German leadership was so full of yes-men and passive-aggressive types, they failed. Different officers were pitted against one another, and it's safe to assume that the majority of them had no idea what was going on. Göring promised Hitler something that he was uncertain about, if put generously himself. Hitler's feeling about retreating made him take Göring's promises at face value. As the chief of the Luftwaffe, Göring was ineffective. Hitler, he once remarked, never inquired about the sorts of aircraft the Luftwaffe possessed, just the numbers instead. This demonstrated that Hitler's total lack of knowledge of the role of air power in the modern battlefield. The Luftwaffe was primarily a tactical air force that supported the Wehrmacht in the Soviet invasion. It lacked the necessary equipment for a major airlift. The Luftwaffe had previously resupplied Wehrmacht soldiers cut off in 1941 to their satisfaction, but it was unable to do so for bigger numbers over the longer distances necessary to maintain the Sixth Army trapped in Stalingrad. Half or more of its airlift capacity was committed to Tunisian airlift happening at the same time. Alongside the aforementioned other circumstances, the Luftwaffe capacity was surpassed when it was asked to conduct two big airlift operations simultaneously. Almost as disastrous was the relocation of 60 to 65% of its fighter units to the west and Mediterranean, resulting in a loss of air supremacy over Stalingrad and the air supply lines to it. Moreover, as the aforementioned Red Army's offensive that laid siege to Stalingrad gained traction, nearby German airfields were seized, lengthening the resupply flights and therefore the aircraft's capacity. It should be emphasized that the operating assumption was that the airlift would be shorter in length and the Operation Snowstorm conducted by Manstein would have been successful. But this, of course, was not the case, as both operations were carried out under unfavorable circumstances. Operation Winter Storm was reduced to only 2 divisions and 232 tanks, and the events at Tunisia was once again the perpetrator for the Luftwaffe's failure. The Wehrmacht deployed the 10th Panzer Division consisting of 160 tanks, the 190 Panzer Battalion of which it had 72 tanks, and the 501st Tiger Battalion with 45 tanks to Tunisia in November and December, totaling 277 tanks. Operation Snowstorm would have likely seen success if it had a total of 509 tanks along with the newly introduced Tigers instead of just 232, especially with additional air assistance from the Luftwaffe. The siege of Stalingrad could not have come at a worse time for Hitler. It was almost like the Allies had paved the way for the unfavorable situation, in which they indefinitely did so. When evaluating the Battle of Stalingrad, one must examine whether the Sixth Army would have been able to hold out against the Soviet forces even if the airlift operation had been a success. The answer is probably not. So, if the Luftwaffe had been able to deliver 500 tons each day as required, the bare minimum for the Sixth Army to hold out, the sheer magnitude of the Red Army's forces around the Wehrmacht would have proved decisive. This argument is based on the idea that no encircled army can successfully hold out against an enemy permanently. Given the logistics as well as the reality that by the spring of 1943, any possibility for relief of Stalingrad via ground offensives or the escape of the Sixth Army had been shattered by the Red Army's substantial westward progress. The Luftwaffe prevented from achieving the effective maintenance standards necessary to fly minimum quotas of sorties. Was only able to provide the Sixth Army with 350 tons each day, far less than the estimated demand of 500 tons per day. Due to integrating multiple pressures from the Red Army Air Force threats as well as the Russian winter, General Paulus attributed the failure of the airlift attempt for his army's downfall, despite the job assigned to the 4th Air Fleet in late 1942 being too difficult for the resources available and the circumstances of the Eastern Front. It is also important to note that, during the time of the airlift, the weather had been at its worst state in the last 100 years, which kept the planes grounded, but also, when the planes did end up flying, the carburetors were susceptible to icing as well as the flight control surfaces. Secondly, logistics was a main problem as most planes were unable to land at airfields due to the position of the Red Army soldiers as well as the weather, owing to the reduced ceiling caused by thick clouds. The planes were easy targets for the Soviet anti-aircraft weapons as a result. Thirdly, on the Western Front, the Luftwaffe was losing a lot of aircrafts fighting the Battle of Berlin. As a result, the planes could not be transferred to resupply the Wehrmacht in Stalingrad. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you have a nice day.